Welcome to the Alexandria Center for Hellenistic Studies and Institute for Mediterranean Studies Neoplatonic Lectures. We are very honored and equally happy that Professor Michael Griffin is with us today. Michael is going to talk on ladders of virtue and inspiration in Porphyry and Iamblichus. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation, Michael. Before giving you the floor, I would like to say just a few words to present you as custom has it. We all know who Michael Griffin is. He is an associate professor of classics and philosophy at the University of British Columbia and currently head of the Department of Ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern Studies. He holds a BA from the University of British Columbia and a Master and DPhil from the University of Oxford. He is the author of many books, articles, and book chapters on late ancient philosophy. His books include Aristotle's Categories in the Early Roman Empire, by Oxford University Press in 2015, based on his 2009 doctoral dissertation, as well as a 2-volume translation of Olympiodorus of Alexandria's Lectures on the First Alcibiades by Bloomsbury Academic in 2014 and 2016, respectively. With Professor Richard Sorabji, he is co-editor of the Ancient Commentators on Aristotle series, which we all know, of course. He is also currently a participant in the Buddhist Platonist Dialogues Working Group, co-hosted by Yale University and by the National University of Singapore, and additionally head, I think, of the Olympiodorus online project, which aims at making more widely available Olympiodorus lectures on the First Alcibiades. And his current book project focuses on the scale of virtues in Greek Neoplatonism. But I think one should also say that Michael is clearly more than a gifted modern Neoplatonic scholar. So like Olympiodorus, is a defender of classical paedia and tradition. And like a true Neoplatonist, he is committed to the view that philosophy can have a role in self-knowledge and self-improvement and in individual and collective well-being, eudaimonia. So his project on Delphic philosophy focuses precisely on philosophy as a means for well-being and through self-knowledge. But his interest in the culture of the West, of the Eastern Mediterranean, is even wider, as one can see from his very early publications. I have discovered a couple of publications on Apollos Hoc in Aristophanes, and even on a middle Minoan egg cup at the University of British Columbia. And I must say, and I will end with this, that I have myself learned a lot from him about the Egyptian Amduat, because when we launched the project, he was by some Neoplatonic coincidence studying the Amduat. So Ra on his Mesektet bark appeared, as it were, to him through the launch email. And we have had some rather lengthy discussions on this. So Michael, thank you very much for this and for having accepted the invitation today. We are very happy and very eager to listen to you.
Thank you so much, Irene, for the beautifully gracious and very generous introduction. It's so nice to see you and lovely to see everyone here. I'm honored to have a chance to talk with you and grateful for the magic of Zoom. So I can join you all the way from Vancouver, even with that wonderful Cretan connection of Minoan cups and the images behind you. So I'm very, very glad to be here. Maybe I can just check first if you can hear me all right, if everything's okay with the sound.
Okay, so I will
Lovely,
share the
okay.
handout.
Thank you. And I'll do a little bit of screen sharing as well, but if at any point anything is muddled, please let me know in the text chat or jump in and let me know or stop me anytime as well. So I'm going to see if screen sharing will work. Just as I'm going to do that, I'll mention that the handout Irene's posting is the handout of texts. So all the primary texts that I'll be referring to should be there. And that's distinct from the slides I'll be showing. So this is the handout with the different texts that Irene's putting in the text chat. And maybe we can repost that a few times as the talk goes on. And they're all keyed by number, T1, T2, and T3, and so on. But hopefully it doesn't get too confusing. I'll share the slides at the same time as we have the handout. So hopefully that's visible as well. If you can't see the slides, let me know. So I'm hoping to share today a project about the philosophical commentators who worked in Athens and Alexandria in the 5th and 6th centuries. And the question that I'll start out with and end with is whether a philosopher can be absorbed in contemplation and engaged in practically virtuous action at the same time. And I'll be winding up suggesting that some features of the concept of inspiration, of enthusiasmos, helps some of our later Athenian and Alexandrian commentators to say, yes, that it is possible to contemplate and act at once. And along the way, we'll find that this involves accommodating two different accounts of human attention. So one that is articulated by Porphyry, in which we can attend to one sort of thing at a time, intelligibles or sensibles, and the other, an account of attention articulated by Iamblichus, or at least I'll try to frame it this way, where our attention, as long as it's receptive to inspiration, can attend to many kinds of things at once. So because of that, this is also partly a story about harmonizing Porphyry with Iamblichus. And I'll suggest that the well-known contrast and integration of philosophical and theurgic modes of assent in later Platonism, also associated with Porphyry and Iamblichus, might be in some ways resolved into a contrast and integration between these two different pictures of attention and how they think about them. So in the roadmap that's on the slide on screen now, and also on the handout under overview section 1, if you're looking at the handout of texts at the top left, I'm going to start out now saying a little bit about the later ancient Platonists, even though I think most of those on the call know more about this than I do. And then I'll go to a sort of sketch of the structure of the scale of virtues motivated by the different ways that Plato represents Socrates. So that's sections 2 and 3 in the roadmap, which will sort of help to set us up for the rest of the talk. And then in section 4, I'm going to present this sort of Porphyrian model of attending to one sort of thing at a time, intelligible forms and the sensible world, and the idea that we can look back and forth between them in a way that helps us to act well. And then 5th, I'll come to the more Iamblichian picture, at least as I'll try to frame it, where rather than being like a painter looking between the paradigmatic form and the canvas of our habits and actions, we're like a dancer, just receptive to the inspiration. And then I'll try to wrap up with a few general conclusions. A few words by way of background, although again, I think this is more familiar to many of you even than to me. I'll be focusing fairly narrowly as we go on the philosophers we usually call Neoplatonists, especially those of them who wrote and taught in Greek and did not self-identify as Christians. And I'll be talking mostly about Neoplatonists with roots or branches in Athens and Alexandria. And while recognizing Neoplatonist as a questionable modern periodization, I'll just use it here for convenience. These people, as again, many of you know so well, were professionalized scholars and teachers. I thought I'd put up a map of at least where some of the stars we're talking about were either born perhaps or taught. We can think about how central they were to the web work of paideia, of education that Irene mentioned and Edward Watts told us about so richly in an earlier session of this group. We could also talk about them as belonging loosely to what Brian Stock called textual communities, people who articulated their identities and authority from their ability to access and interpret authoritative texts, particularly, but not only, Plato and Aristotle. And so in a sense, philosophical activity merged with commentary because of this way of organizing and teaching philosophy. Many of these figures are familiar through imagery and classic discussions of the late antique holy person, and maybe most iconically, the philosopher can be pictured with their eyes directed upward, gazing at the stars, or more precisely, absorbed in contemplation of the eternal forms beyond the stars, a little like these images, which might represent Plotinus and sometimes argued Proclus, certainly a late Neoplatonist. Some of you may know more about the art history and could set me straight on that. But this symbolism has had a remarkable afterlife. It's reinscribed in Raphael's celebrated school of Athens, of course, this sort of upward gaze. There's Plato pointing upward. Of course, Plato's own Socrates in Republic 7 would remind us not to take the gesture too literally. It's not really just the stars, but the forms beyond them that we should look to. Whereas we have Aristotle pointing forward or downward, Plato's holding the Timaeus, and Aristotle's holding the Nicomachean Ethics. And there you can see in a way that not exactly the tension, but the dialogue between the two pictures of philosophy, gazing at the eternal and non-contingent and unchanging principles with Plato, and thinking about how to practice or live a philosophy with Aristotle. A little bit like the vision of contemplation and action that I'll be talking about today. You can even think about that in modern moving pictures with Hypatia of Alexandria, portrayed in the 2009 film Agora. She also can gaze at the stars contemplatively and of course try her best to teach and practice in the polis of Alexandria. So all of these pictures lead in a way to a potential tension in Neoplatonism, or maybe I could say again, dialogue. How can the philosopher be at once a virtuoso contemplative and a practical agent for good in her community? With my eyes trained metaphorically on the stars, it's hard to see what's in front of me, like Thales, I'm at risk of falling into a well. Of course, this is a very well-known problem, the tension between the models of happiness in Nicomachean Ethics 1 and 10, for example. And even in the school of Athens, we can imagine Aristotle gently reminding Plato not to forget what's in front of his feet. To see how the later Platonists as commentators engaged in that apparent tension, coming now to section 2 on the separate handout of texts that Irene put in the chat, it's helpful to paint a picture of how they described and related themselves to Plato's iconic philosopher, to Socrates. Immediately, they faced a kind of challenge, which we also know well today, that Plato offers his reader many Socrateses, a kind of iconic prism for the philosophical life. And here are just 4 of them, each one significant to the Neoplatonists in a different kind of way. So coming now to the Neoplatonic Socrates, if you have the handout of texts in front of you, again, this is section 2 on page 1. So first of all, we could say what I've labeled A, there's the embodied and socially active gadfly of the city, the kind of Socrates maybe we see in the Apology or the Gorgias that Platonists say with political or constitutional or civic goodness and large stretches of the first Alcibiades. And there's lots of texts that illustrate this, I think, quite well, although we would read them differently perhaps than some of the Platonist commentators. So if you look at T1 on the handout, maybe this is a nice example from the Apology around 30e, the famous passage where Socrates says, I've literally been attached to the city as if to a large thoroughbred horse that was somewhat sluggish because of its size and needed to be awakened by some sort of gadfly, muopostinos, always minding your business, humetron pratenae, visiting each of you in private like a father or elder brother to persuade you to care about arete. So this Socrates is certainly not pictured, I think, as in isolation, contemplating the contents of his mind or the stars metaphorically. In fact, he's always minding your business. He's deeply engaged in practical civic life. And then B, what I've labeled B, a different picture of Socrates, again, very well known. Maybe the epicenter of this image is in the Phaedo, but occurring in many other places where he seems to be the paradigm of a successful, if partial, ascetic withdrawal from embodied perceptions and appetites and in general, social and appetitive motivations. This Socrates seems to be deeply separated from the concerns of the body and the polis. Maybe T5 on the handout is a nice example where this also well-known text, Socrates talks about purification or catharsis as the separation, chorisdein, of the soul as far as possible from the body and dwelling by itself in isolation. And this kind of purification allows Socrates or the ideal philosopher to contemplate the forms more clearly. And then again with C, quite close to B, but a little different in focus, there's Socrates as the archetypal contemplative, absorbed in the vision of forms or ideas and striving for likeness to the divine, as in dialogues maybe like the Symposium and the Theaetetus or parts of the Theaetetus. And this really amplifies the imagery of Socrates as separate from embodied and social life. There's some nice images of this in T2 on the handout, again on page 1 from the Symposium, that nice passage where Agathon talks about how it's one of Socrates' habits to go off and stand motionless, apostas hopoi and tuke hesteken, the Symposium 175b to d, wherever he is, and the result might be a certain amount of wisdom that we could get from him. T3 is another passage from the Theaetetus that illustrates the same idea with reference to Pindar and Thales. An interesting contrast with a different passage that's T4 from Xenophon, that Socrates never neglected his body and reproved such neglect in others, which maybe brings out that sense of different pictures. And then maybe D, an inspired Socrates, maybe a little bit less familiar, but certainly no less important to the Neoplatonist commentators. Socrates, who's possessed by the divine, enthusiasmos, entheos, katokos, whether it's with music, ritual, prophecy, or especially love. This is maybe most tied to the commentary tradition on the Phaedrus, where he's possessed by the nymphs and the environment and espouses the divine madness of the muses, of embodied ritual practices, of the oracles, and of love. So if we thought of all of that plurality of different Socrateses, T6, by the way, is an example of the inspired Socrates, full of Bacchic frenzy and ecstasy. We might approach them in all kinds of different ways. Today, we often suppose that Plato changes his mind over time about the qualities of the ideal philosopher, and maybe some of these, like the embodied gadfly of the city, is nearer the historical Socrates and chronologically earlier, and others, like the absorbed contemplative of the Symposium, Theaetetus, come later. And the later ancient Platonists were certainly more sensitive to those factors than we've sometimes given them credit for. Daniel Lane and Harold Tarrant's volume on the Neoplatonic Socrates brings that out very artfully, I think. But of course, their hermeneutic for resolving this kind of plurality is very different. They're not developmentalist about the dialogues in any strong sense. They look for Plato to be consistent, just as earlier Alexandrian commentators looked for Homer to be consistent. They assume that Plato always writes with one conception of philosophy and its content in mind, even if it's unfolded in a different pedagogical way for different readership, or with attention to the way of knowing that corresponds to each character in the dialogue. So because of that, when our ancient commentators faced the sort of prism of these different Socrateses, they had to show how he could be followed in the ambit of a single philosophical life. And that gave rise to the sort of edifice or superstructure I'm going to talk about next, the scale of virtues for organizing curriculum and conceptualizing moral and perceptual progress over a life. Just before I come to that, I wanted to bring out the sort of central apparent tension that I'll circle back to at the end of the talk, which is between the socially active Socrates, or the philosopher as engaged in their society, and the contemplative. There's a nice way of framing the concern about the apparent tension between the two in terms of the, to quote from Julia Annis, the oblivious sage. I think John Dillon gave a nice sort of metaphor for why the oblivious sage would seem to be a problem. This would be somebody who would certainly help someone across the road if they happen to notice their need, but being so absorbed in contemplation would in practice be most unlikely to do so. So if there's really a strong motivation to spend all of our time in contemplation, would we ever actually help those around us in the way we would expect a good person to do? So the sort of tension between some of these versions of Socrates, I'll come back to as illustrative, but especially that one, how the contemplator can also be a good person in practice. And eventually, as I go through the text and the way the scale of virtues, I think, can accommodate that problem, that will be the concern I hope to illustrate a couple of different solutions to how to be a good person while contemplating or in dialogue with contemplation. So we're coming now to section 3 on the handout. If you're looking at the handout of texts that Irene circulated, this is on the second page. And it's a kind of outline of the so-called scale of virtues, or bathmoi aratone, or scala virtutum. There's a kind of quick and rough table on the second page of the handout, and I'll also try to go through it in sequence in the slides. Again, for many of you, this will be even more familiar than it is to me, and there's lots of different ways of looking at it, so I'm looking forward to the discussion to see if you can help me understand it a bit better. I've been thinking about it for years, as some of you know, and I'm still trying to figure it out. So the language of steps that we'll be coming to is drawn ultimately from the rising stairs of Diotima's speech in Plato's Symposium, the ladder of love or beauty, and the concept of the scale, again, originating in a way in all the different archetypes of the philosopher that we can see already in Plato, is anticipated in earlier so-called Middle Platonism. You can find prefigurations of the underlying ideas, at least as early as Cicero, but it really comes into its own with Plotinus and Porphyry and their successors, who are maybe under a different kind of pressure to show to their world how a philosopher's civic and embodied virtue relates systematically to the contemplative life, especially to the ideal of likeness to God, or homoiosis to Theo, which is, as Sedley and Annis and many others, some of you here have shown, became so central to the life of philosophy from Eudorus and his contemporaries in the 1st century onward. I've given maybe the most famous slogan-like passage explaining this goal on the screen, and it's also on the handout as T7, that the flight is to become like God as far as possible, and likeness is becoming just and holy with wisdom, which amounts to seeking arete. I've also on this page of the handout, the second page, given just a handful of the different sources for the scale of virtues. It's the first footnote on page 2, some of the primary sources, and a handful of modern studies, though there's many more, I think it's a really interesting structure to study, as we'll go through in a moment, because it touches on curriculum, biography, civic engagement, and exegesis in late antiquity. And all the different studies of the scale have, some of them are very comprehensive, recent overviews by Kiradana and Finnemore, some focus on particular issues, like the top end of the scale and what it tells us about theurgy, inspiration and ritual practice. And Shepard, who's here, I think, wrote about this in a way I know Helmick and Vargas engaged with. What's the difference between ritual and inspiration and mystical union? And there's lots more to say anyway, so I do look forward to talking more about it. I'm going to try to build it up from the beginning here, because I think it'll give us a helpful framework to talk from, and then get to the more complicated forms as we go along. So in a way, the whole thing, as complicated as it gets, starts from one exegetical problem, I think, the one we see here at the Theaetetus and other passages where Plato talks about likeness to God. Socrates says that we should try to become like God as far as we can, or as far as human nature permits, and explains that this homeosis or process of assimilation or likening amounts to becoming just and holy with phronesis or wisdom. And then that whole package is construed as virtue or excellence, arete. But then the sense in which this Platonist philosopher's God is virtuous or just or brave in general seems quite different from the sense in which any ordinary person is just or brave. For example, what fears would this philosophical God to whom we're likening ourselves ever have to overcome to be brave? So if virtue for the divine is so profoundly and fundamentally different from virtue for you and me, then how could similarity to such a very different archetype reliably help us to become more like that archetype or more virtuous? So that's sort of maybe the deepest exegetical puzzle. There's different approaches to the puzzle. It's in Alcinous and different Platonists. I mentioned there's some evidence in Cicero already, but Plotinus approaches the problem like this in treatises like 1-2 on virtues. And I'll try to sort of populate this table as we go to fill out how I'm understanding the development of the story. So Plotinus grants in 1-2 that virtue for a god is different from virtue for a person. In particular, the Platonist or Aristotelian god is a pure mind or awareness, continually engaged in contemplation, a sort of joyous act of witnessing reality, like a spectator at the Olympic Games or at the theater. And we're not like that, at least not consistently, because as Aristotle points out in Nicomachean Ethics 10, we need to eat lunch from time to time and help out in our community and so on, but we should strive to contemplate as much as we can. Still, as Plotinus seems to be explaining, even though virtue means something different in these two cases, or more precisely, it's homonymously predicated of gods and humans, it does carry an important sort of focal meaning in both cases. Human virtue is derivative of the god's virtue and imitates or participates it in much the same way that a house's structure imitates and so derives from the house's blueprint or paradigma, archetype or paradigm, which is classic Platonist metaphysics. And this is what Plato means, Plotinus suggests, when he tells us to imitate or liken ourselves to God or the cosmos or even to a good literary paradigm in respect of virtue. It's a bit like a house builder saying, straighten out that wall, imitating a line on the architect's map, even though the linearity on the map and the linearity of the mud brick, let's say, are linear in a very different sense. So from that sort of underlying idea of participation in the type, even though there's such difference between the imitation and the original, Plotinus generates the beginning of this sort of hierarchy that I'll start to try to populate. There is the virtue of the human being in our ordinary sense, which will later be called in a sort of schematic way, politicae, arete, or civic virtue, which amounts to the harmony of the tripartite soul, perhaps, of logos, thumos, and epithumia, and answers to what some earlier Platonists, like Antiochus perhaps, had advocated for as a kind of metriopatheia, or moderation of the passions. And this is quite similar to the account of the harmonious soul in Republic 4. and can be expressed in just and helpful behavior in society. And then there's we could call the sort of paradigmatic virtue of God or the divine, which amounts simply to the God's proper activity, continually witnessing, for example, the nature of justice itself that is actually part of the God's nature. And the former, the sort of virtue in the polis or in ordinary life, is imitative of and derived from the latter, like the house from the blueprint. And incidentally, the language that implies a kind of clear schema here, different kinds of virtue, isn't really quite there yet in Plotinus, as is often pointed out, but it's certainly part of the more clear and static structure that Porphyry builds up to explain it, which we'll come to in a moment. But Plotinus also recognizes a kind of staircase between these two. So human beings can get closer to divine virtue by withdrawing to some degree from bodily appetites and from the sort of perceptual schema that keeps us here, that is in the sensory and social world, purifying ourselves from these conditions in the language of the Phaedo that we talked about before with the kind of ascetic Socrates, and gradually bringing ourselves nearer to the state of divinity. And these purifications amount to a kind of discipline of the attention. And in fact, if you have the handout of texts with you separately, you can look at T5 for one of the ways this can be understood as a kind of process of concentration or a discipline of concentration. That passage where, again, in Phaedo 67 C to D, T5 on the handout, the philosopher tries to habituate the soul, which is separate to whatever degree it can be, chorisdein and ethicai, to gather and collect itself together, zenegeristhai to kai athroisdisthai, out of every part of the body, and dwell by itself as far as it can, with a sort of freedom from bondage in the body. So we have several intermediate stages. If we add as well the result of that process of purification, which, just as in the Phaedo, is being in a much better position to witness non-contingent eternal forms or patterns. So you can see maybe how the initial tension between a very unlike God, to whom we're supposed to liken ourselves, ramifies itself into the sort of staircase, which is a process that starting from an ordinary kind of civic conception of virtue that Plotinus draws from some of his Platonic and other sources, we can gradually take steps through some of those different pictures of Socrates we started out with, not as alternatives, but as a kind of sequence that leads us to be like a divine paradigm that we were initially unlike. And for each of these intermediate stages, Plotinus identifies some Platonic authority, like the Phaedo, where Socrates does seem to describe purifications as a kind of arete. And then, as I mentioned before, this more fluid account is systematized by Porphyry after Plotinus, who schematizes each stage of virtue and then prepares a way for them to be read as a curriculum. And he also breaks out the paradigmatic as not just the sort of level where archetypes and forms are, but in fact a stage of virtue or arete distinct from contemplation. And that is less clear, to say the least, in Plotinus, as Dominic Omar and others have pointed out. So there's more of the scale to come, sorry, but I'll just pause at this stage for a moment to reorient myself to the tension that I began with. This staircase, as it's codified by Porphyry, explains the tension between absorption and contemplation and action in terms of likeness to the divine. But if we came back to that puzzle of the oblivious sage who might be so busy contemplating that they forget to help someone need to cross the road, we could ask if it addresses that puzzle in any sense. And I'll ask this question about a few different models we come to in the next 10 or 15 minutes. So I found it helpful to frame this question in terms of Porphyry's moral psychology and especially his philosophy of attention. And for this section, I'll be talking about the next few texts on the handout, which are T8, T9, and T10. So if you have the handout of texts in front of you, you can jump to those pages, page 2 and 3 on the handout, texts 8, 9, and 10. First, to look at text 8. So Porphyry says here that we pay attention with the whole of ourselves, and it's worth reading a little bit of this passage to get a sense of the context. He's talking ultimately here about why we should be vegetarians, but as an example of a broader sort of problem, he knows about some people who he calls barbaroi. He talks about it 142. There's debate about who they might be, if they're some have argued libertarian Gnostic groups, some have argued Hermetic, maybe they're also Platonists. They seem to have some connection with Christianity, but whoever they are, the people who he's talking about in the context think it is just fine to engage in sensual activities, including eating animal meat, without getting distracted from the vision of forms. Porphyry denies this. So he says, why should we make the passions or pathe wither and ourselves die to them when we should practice this every day? If it were possible, as some have argued, that's these people, the barbaroi, for us to be active in accordance with Nous or intellect while we're involved in mortal concerns that are unsupervised by Nous. Where there is sensation and apprehension of sensation, that is aesthesis and antilepsis, this sort of apprehensive, representative portrayal of sensation. In that case, as long as that's happening, there's detachment from the intelligible. And in as much as non-rationality is aroused, to that extent, there's detachment from intellection. It's not possible when being carried hither and thither to be there, despite being here, that is in the intelligible, despite being here in the so-called sensible world. And then there's this sort of slogan-like summary: we pay attention not with part of ourselves, but with all of ourselves. Ugar mere hemon al holoitas prosokas poiumetha. So for Porphyry, attention is like a single spotlight that moves really fast. This seems to build on Stoic views about the attentive function of the hegemonikon. So because it's spotlight-like, we can only attend either to the sensory world or to the forms, not to both at once. And Porphyry draws the ascetic conclusions that he needs from this theory of attention. Of course, for our puzzle of the oblivious sage, it just seems to make things worse. So the Neoplatonist Socrates presumably would try to stand on the neighbor's porch as often as possible. That seems to be the implication, and couldn't notice anybody crossing the road because of the spotlight-like function of attention. So moving next to T9 on the handout on the following page, which is from Porphyry's Life of Plotinus, there's a surprise because Porphyry's biography of Plotinus seems to deny that conclusion. This is a really well-known passage. This is from the life around 87 to 24, where he explains, again, T9, Plotinus was wholly concerned with mind or nous. Even if he was talking to somebody and continuing conversation, he kept his train of thought. He could take his necessary part in a conversation to the full, and at the same time keep his attention or his thoughts fixed, terein tein dianoian, without a break on whatever he was considering. When the person he'd been talking to was gone, he went straight on with what came next, keeping the connection. And in this way, he was present both to himself and to others and never relaxed his self-turned attention, pros heoton pros aki, except in sleep. So this seems to suggest that Plotinus is in some way consistently absorbed in contemplation, but also doing a great job of being socially helpful, keeping up his side of conversations and occupying the position of a good embodied sage. And it certainly looks like he's doing both things all the time, which is encouraging news. Maybe Socrates could, after all, be contemplating merrily even when he was bugging sophists and encouraging young people to virtue. And it's certainly appealing to contrast this testimony with the De Abstinentia testimony we looked at as T8. And some people have done that. Charles Britton suggests that Porphyry is describing two completely different views of attention here, a single operation spotlight kind of view and a multiple operation account. Others, I'm thinking of James Wilberding, asks whether the life passage actually does show what it looks like it shows, that Plotinus is engaged in contemplation and action at once. And giving T9 a close reading, Wilberding suggests that it could bear a different reading, that Plotinus is really alternating between intense contemplation and worldly virtue with such remarkable grace that it's seamless, the transition between the intelligible and the sensible, and he's able to draw lessons from the intelligible for the sensible. And I think that's quite a plausible reading of T9, that it's not showing genuine kind of simultaneity in the moment, that it is compatible with Porphyry's theory of attention, but it describes a sort of seamless alternation between the two. Or if you like, from the picture we're looking at on screen, passing between politicae and theoreticae, arete, with such grace and smoothness that you hardly notice the transitions, and nothing is lost from the contents of the mind. So it doesn't give us a golden standard of a philosopher simultaneously contemplating and acting, but it does help with the oblivious sage problem. It gives us the rudiments of a good, plausible argument for why a philosopher should engage in contemplation and doesn't alienate their practical virtue entirely. Attending to the form of justice or the form of beauty will allow the philosopher to act more justly or more beautifully in practice. And presumably one could balance one's life between the two, contemplating enough to get a good grasp of the form and then putting it into practice, sort of like a phone that needs to be charged from time to time. Maybe the philosopher has to plug in to the forms to charge now and again, and they can't really be put to use while they're plugged in, but it's really worthwhile because they're charged up to act, and the alternation is so graceful that it's not problematic. Thinking of it this way, as a kind of really graceful alternation between the two, a nice exemplary passage is from the Republic, and this is text 10 on the handout. We're in the middle in the context of the Republic of Socrates describing how philosophers might be useful in the polis. And he's just describing, if I read a little from T10 from Republic 6, how the philosopher becomes as divine and cosmios or orderly as a human being can, resembling the language about becoming godlike. And if the philosopher should then be compelled to make a practice in private and public of stamping what they see in the eternal world into people's characters, instead of shaping only their own, would they be a poor demiurge of moderation, justice, and virtue? Well, not at all, says Glaucon. Then will they be harsh with philosophers when we say there's no way a city can find eudaimonia unless its plan is drawn by painters who use the divine paradigma or model, taking the city and people's characters or athe as their sketching slate? And then the passage I really want to emphasize here is they would look often in each direction, hekateros apoblepoien, on the one hand toward what is in nature just, beautiful, temperate, and all the rest, and on the other toward what they're trying to put into human beings until they've made people's characters as dear to the gods as possible. So that sort of package of the adverb and verb, hekateros apoblepoien, is what I wanted to especially capture here, the image of the painter, the philosopher in practice as a painter who's glancing back and forth with such grace and smoothness, like perhaps Wilberding's reading of the Life of Plotinus passage, that they're able to put the model into practice in their own athe or psyche, or the athe and psyche of all those around them. So this is, pausing for a moment, one sort of picture of an answer to the oblivious sage puzzle: rapid, graceful alternation with a single spotlight of attention, like a painter, between original and the sketching slate of character and the soul. I'm going to come next to section 5 and a different model of answering the puzzle, which will populate more of the scale of virtues as well. And with this, I'm going to turn from Porphyry's schematization we've looked at so far to Iamblichus's, but I'm also going to draw on the later Athenian and Alexandrian commentators, particularly Damascius and Olympiodorus and Hermias, and the way in which they perhaps harmonize or bring together the Porphyrian and what I'll be pitching as the Iamblichian accounts. But first of all, I'll try to show how Iamblichus, as is I think relatively well known, fills out the table we're looking at on the screen right now with more levels of virtue, as what we've seen so far is to some degree Plotinus as schematized by Porphyry. So first of all, according to the anonymous prolegomena to Platonic philosophy, a little bit around 26 that I haven't put on the handout, it was Iamblichus who added some distinct forms of quasi-virtue originating in nature and habituation to the scale as a whole, which you can see here now in the table as levels 1 and 2, natural and habituative virtue or goodness, arising respectively from temperament or crossus and habit or ethos. And this is, I think, just Iamblichus bringing into play some of Aristotle's remarks in the Nicomachean Ethics 2 and 6, that one can have a sort of virtue, courage, and so on that arises from natural temperament, as a lion is congenitally brave, or from upbringing and socialization, as in Nicomachean Ethics 2:1. And as some of the Platonist commentators point out, there's already a tendency to distinguish those sorts of quasi-virtue in the statesman and the laws. Iamblichus is also probably behind the structure of the whole systematic curriculum based on earlier versions like Alcinous, that helpfully tell you which Platonic dialogues to study with a teacher in what order to achieve the relevant levels of virtue. So I'll populate the right-hand side of the table with some of those texts. But more significantly, and maybe more famously, Iamblichus is reported as adding new highest tiers of virtue. And if you go to T11 on the handout, which is the first text under section 5 on the handout, absorption and action in unison, T11 is from Damascius. This is the passage in which he outlines 7 levels of virtue, a little like we're seeing on screen. In T11, there's 1, the natural, 2, the habituative, 3, the civic or constitutional, 4, the purificatory, 5, the contemplative, and 6, the archetypal or paradigmatic, and lastly, 7, the hieratic virtues. I'll read a little from T11 going on. The hieratic virtues, which belong to the godlike theoides part of the soul, they correspond to all the categories mentioned above, that is, all the other levels of virtue, with the difference that while the others are existential, these are unitary, adapted from Westerink. This anti-parekusai passais tais eremenes usiodesin usais eniaiga huparkusai. So the correspondence in the plural is interesting. There's a kind of plurality of hieratic virtues corresponding to the other levels of the scale. I'll come back to that in a moment. This kind too has been outlined by Iamblichus and discussed more explicitly by the school of Proclus. Incidentally, Damascius says here in a bit I've elided that Iamblichus is responsible as well for introducing the paradigmatic virtues, but the emphasis is on the introduction of the hieratic virtues. So at this stage, thanks to Iamblichus, as we know from the anonymous prolegomena in this passage of Damascius, if we read it this way at least, we filled out all 7 levels of the scale, and we've got the more or less standard picture. And most of the attention goes to the top, the idea that Iamblichus has elevated the whole repertory of late antique Neoplatonist ritual, life, and praxis into this picture. So in a way, resolving a different kind of tension, not a tension between the civic or embodied philosophical life and the contemplative life, but the tension between philosophical practice and theurgical or ritual practice, or a different conception, at least, of philosophical assent. And where the philosophical disciplines we've talked about so far might lead to a sort of eternal contemplation of divine reality, the sacred rites lead to actually being divine reality in practice. And this, again, is usually seen as new with Iamblichus. Here's another way of divvying these up, which we find in these sources, I think. Depending on the idea that philosophy amounts to the education of reason, we can also say that the bottom 2 levels belong before philosophy or before the education of reason. The middle tier belongs to philosophy proper, and the top tier is in a way beyond philosophy. We can find different accounts along those lines in Ammonius, Damascius, and Olympiodorus in the 6th century. We can also see some different attributions. It gets a little bit confusing, but roughly it looks like the middle 3 and arguably the paradigmatic are variously attributed to Plotinus and Porphyry among the Athenian and Alexandrian commentators, the top stage to Iamblichus, and those bottom 2 as well to Iamblichus. So that's what I mean in the sources column, not necessarily the sources that we think are guaranteed to be true, but at least the sources that are intended in the later commentaries. So if we recapitulate, we've got the whole picture of all 7, capturing the 7 in their Damascian form. And you can see the different versions of Socrates here too, at least initially pictured, although our inspired Socrates is not so clearly present And I'll come back to that, but we've certainly got our civic Socrates, our ascetic Socrates, our contemplative Socrates, and arguably we'll see the inspiration has a place at the top as well. So with that in the background, here's a couple of challenges that I think we could pick up in this picture. We've already talked about the challenge, I'll just briefly reiterate, of the alternating picture of contemplation and action in T8, T9, and T10, and maybe a way that the scale can accommodate that painterly model. But if we think about the upper tiers, I think I can explain why there's some challenges to resolve. So first of all, the surviving sources for the version of the scale I just went through are the last generation of Platonists, as we talked about, like Damascius and Olympiodorus in their lectures on the Phaedo, and Damascius's Life of Isidore, and Marinus, where it governs his Life of Proclus, as Blumenthal, Amar, and others have shown. And I've put texts describing just very briefly or compressing those outlines as T11 to T14 on the handout. But when we look at the upper tiers, there seems to be inconsistency, as Festuger and Saffre and Segons and Westerink all pointed out, in fact, arguing that they're irreconcilable. So very briefly, Damascius in T11 seems to give us 7 stages, like the picture I just shared, with the paradigmatic virtues just below the hieratic. But Marinus, and this is text 14, excludes or appears to exclude paradigmatic virtues and talks about another stage above the hieratic, which he seems to call the theurgic. So if you look at T14 on the handout, Marinus says, let's divide the virtues into their kinds. This is leading into or providing an on-ramp for the life of Proclus. The natural, 1, the ethical or habituative, 2, the political or civic, 3, then those which transcend these, 4, the purificatory, 5, the contemplative, and 6, the theurgic, and 7, those that are higher even than these, well, we'll keep silence about them because they exceed the human condition. So this seems to, on the surface at least, drop out the paradigmatic in Damascius. And then complicating things further, if you go to T13 on the handout, under section 5, T13 is Olympiodorus on the Phaedo 8.2. This is the equivalent passage to Damascius that we looked at as T11. Olympiodorus says, let's enumerate the degrees of virtues. They are 5. 1 natural, 2 habituative, 3 civic, 4 purificatory, and 5 contemplative. But Plotinus holds there's 6, another degree, that of the paradigms, which is our soul that's first illuminated by Nous, then becomes in a way identical with the source of the illumination and acts unifically according to the paradigmatic virtues. That's at least a slightly different way of reading it than Westerink's, which is in union with the One. I think it could be read as acts unifically according to the paradigmatic virtues. So the object of philosophy in T13, he goes on, is to make us nous, that of theurgy, to unite us with the intelligible principles and conform our activities to the paradigms. So here Olympiodorus, well, he talks about 5 stages, but he seems to mean 5 before the paradigmatic. Then he adds the paradigmatic, which gives us 6. And it seems a bit odd that we don't get 7. And there's plenty of different reasons why these different sources might not line up. That is T11, Damascius, T12, Olympiodorus, and then Marinus. So, sorry, by the way, there's a typo there. The Olympiodorus should be T13. One argument that's quite familiar is that Olympiodorus, like Ammonius, faced considerable pressure from a largely Christian classroom and colleagues in Alexandria to attenuate and elide the role of ritual altogether. Richard Sorabji made proposals along those lines, and there's been quite a bit of debate about that. We could also resolve the puzzle in a slightly different way, I think, and that's what I'll try to do for the next few minutes before I wrap up. So if we look at a few complementary texts, Olympiodorus's lectures on the first Alcibiades, which are dear to my heart, probably delivered a bit later in Olympiodorus's life. Hermias's notes on Plato's Phaedrus, which have recently been translated. Shout out to Dirk Baltzley and Michael Scher, the 2 wonderful volumes. And we draw on those texts with a slightly different picture of Olympiodorus on the Phaedo. I think we might be able to bring a kind of integration to those different sources, or at least I'll try to present it that way and see if you agree. So first, I want to turn to T15 on the handout, which is Olympiodorus on Alcibiades 172, 5-12. On T15, I'll read a little bit of this. Self-knowledge is said in many ways. He goes on, it's possible, this integrates a slightly different scale, but you can see how it connects into the scale of virtues. It's possible to know oneself with respect to one's external possessions, and it's possible to know oneself with respect to one's body, and it's possible to know oneself as a civic or social person. The origin of this tripartition is probably a little bit earlier in Plato, but we can talk about that later. Now we're getting into the scale of virtues more explicitly. That is politikos, when one knows oneself in the tripartition of one's soul. There's logos, thumos, and epithumia. And then it's possible 4 to know yourself as a purificatory person in liberation from the pathe. And then 5, it's possible to know yourself as a contemplative, contemplating yourself as liberated. It's possible to know yourself theologically, knowing yourself according to your paradigmatic form or idea. And it's possible to know oneself in an inspired sense, enthusiastikos, according to unity, and so bonded to one's proper God, act with inspiration. There's some other passages I've mentioned, the Alcibiades Lectures, page 20, lines 4-13, on choosing the walk of life that is properly bonded to your God, and so acting authentically with inspiration. So this passage applies the scaffolding of the scale of virtues as a kind of scale of self-knowledge. It solves an exegetical problem at that point in the Alcibiades. And it does seem to show that Olympiodorus does include the top tier of virtues, the 7th in Damascius, here at least, under the name of inspiration or enthusiasmos. So I think it's clear that at least at the time Olympiodorus is delivering the Alcibiades lectures, there isn't a social or philosophical issue about including all 7 of those levels, and incidentally distinguishing the top 2. You can see in that text in T15 that he distinguishes the paradigmatic virtues of self-knowledge theologically, theologikos, number 6, and what Damascius calls the hieratic virtues, it seems, but here under the title of inspiration, number 7. So that's one passage I wanted to recruit. The second, from Hermias in the treatment of the Phaedrus, based on the seminar by Syrianus, also very well known, I think, with a bit of a different picture of the top tier of the scale. And Shepherd famously explained how the Hermias passages could give us a kind of higher non-ritual form of theurgy, maybe distinctly mystical union and a kind of white magic and ritual purification in between. And Helmig and Vargas in a series of recent articles have also argued artfully for the unity of theurgy. But without entering that discussion in the detail it deserves, I'd like to draw on Hermias to try to solve a bit of this puzzle too. So it looks like what Damascius called the most divine element of the soul, back in T11, is in Hermias the most divine and most unified part. This is T16 from Hermias's commentary, where he talks about another part of the soul that's the highest and most unified, the one of the soul, hentes psyches, which bears the image of the one beyond being and gives unity to the whole soul. And it looks like there's a parallelism between Damascius and Hermias, where they're both talking about this part of the soul and its capacity to be inspired in the highest sense. And what Hermias talks about is the ability of the one of the soul, especially to be inspired in music and dance, purification, prophecy, and love. And this, of course, draws on the 4 divine madnesses of the Phaedrus, which we mentioned a little bit earlier on. In T19 on the handout, I've just briefly sketched Hermias's picture of the 4 kinds of inspiration, again, fairly well known. But in case you haven't come across it recently, the inspiration of the Muses, the inspiration of Dionysus, inspiration of Apollo, and inspiration of love, which have the inward activities respectively of harmonizing the psyche, making a whole of the psyche, bringing the psyche into unity and fusing its unity with the gods, and have their respective forms of outward activity as well. I'll come back to Hermias in a moment, but just to go to one other passage first, I think we could argue that the highest kind of inspiration is identical with Damascius's hieratic virtue, about which we must keep silent, says Marinus. That inspiration for Hermias, he's fairly explicit about this, cascades through the entire person. So in T18, you can see an example of this, I think. The inspiration that's really from the gods is of the one of the soul above the discursive thought and intellect. But when it's illuminated, the whole of life, the intellect, discursive thought, the irrational part of the soul, and he goes on to say all the way down to the body itself, are wholly inspired. The third point before coming back to Hermias I wanted to raise circles back to T13, to Olympiodorus. So I think we could recast his treatment of paradigmatic virtue here in a way that's consistent with Hermias and the Alcibiades passage. So sort of putting together everything from T11 down to T19. It's true that in the Phaedo commentary, if you come back to T13 with me for a moment, Olympiodorus omits any explicit mention of inspired or hieratic virtue, not maybe because of some external pressure, but maybe partly out of the kind of general preference not to speak of it that Marinus raises, and maybe because it's not part of the ambit of the Phaedo, which in Iamblichus's curriculum belongs lower down in the scale with cathartic virtue. In that solution, you might wonder, why then does he mention it in the Alcibiades commentary? But I think it's because it's necessary to solve a specific puzzle there to explain Socrates' position on inspiration. So maybe you can make a case that the curricular place of the text has something to do with which are mentioned. But what I really want to emphasize is that in T13, Olympiodorus, I think, clearly equates paradigmatic virtue with theurgy, and says that it allows a bond with Nous, or the intelligible gods. This is the passage where he's saying that our soul becomes identical in a way with the source of illumination and acts unifically according to the paradigmatic virtues, and that theurgy unites us with the intelligibles. And that's consistent. That is the idea that theurgy equates to paradigmatic virtue with what Proclus says in excerpts from the Cratylus commentary. And with apologies for the jumping around, if you go to text 17 on the handout, text 17 is from section 113 of Proclus's Cratylus commentary, where he says they've been able to reveal the limit of the intelligible gods only by name and indicate the beings beyond by analogy alone. At the intelligible level itself of the gods, only this God who encompasses the paternal order is said by the wise to be nameable, and theurgy ascends all the way to this order, suggesting that theurgy reaches to the intelligibles. So I think that's, if we put all those together, Proclus and the Cratylus is consistent with Olympiodorus on the Phaedo, that is T17 and T13, that theurgy is paradigmatic virtue, arguably, which reaches to the intelligibles, and that there is a higher tier than that. And then that would be consistent with Damascius's account and Marinus. The higher tier is the one Marinus says we should keep silence about. That is the highest virtues of inspiration, or at least that's the pitch I'd like to make. You can put them all together if you allow that paradigmatic virtue and theurgy reaching to the intelligibles is one thing, but reaching the one of the soul, inspiration, and what can also be called a hieratic art, to be confusingly, is the seventh stage above that. Now, coming back to Hermias, and then I promise to wrap up quickly, Hermias's account of divine inspiration has some key features that are relevant here, also familiar to many of you, I think. In its strictest sense, inspiration applies only to the one of the soul, as we saw, but cascades through the whole person, including the body. And this, of course, allows the later Neoplatonists to celebrate embodied experience. So that's T18 on the handout, but also the kinds of outward activities in my summary as T19, activities of music and dance and ritual and prophecy. So there's one more step in this kind of integration, which is maybe more dramatic, but I hope you might find persuasive, the fourth and last. This goes back to text 11 on the handout, that is Damascius on the Phaedo, 144. There, Damascius's picture of the whole scale of virtues puts inspired or hieratic virtue, if you'll allow me to equate them, at the top. And as in Hermias, as influencing the one of the soul. That's how Hermias talks about it. In T11, Damascius uses the language of the most godlike part of the soul, but I think they're talking about the same thing, the most divine part of the person, or that one of the soul. And Damascius says that every virtue somehow represented here in a way that corresponds to the other virtues. This is the passage in the plural I was talking about, the antiparvekusai, passis, and so on, in T11. I think that plural is interesting, and Hermias helps to explain what Damascius means. He outlines in that summary of all the kinds of divine madness that I've given as T19 on the handout, that all the primary forms of inspiration give us this neat hierarchy, which is pretty well known, the 4 kinds of madness, the Muses, Dionysus, Apollo, and Eros, or music, ritual, prophecy, and love, and that ultimately we can act with inspiration in any walk of life as a result. And I'm wondering if this hierarchy of inspirations can be taken to correspond to the scale of virtues. This is just a hypothesis, where each form of madness motivates and answers to a level of virtue. So for example, the madness of the Muses harmonizes the soul's motivations just as civic virtue does. The madness of Dionysus makes them whole, just as purificatory virtue does. The inspiration of Apollo, or prophetic inspiration, makes a unity in the same way that contemplative virtue leads toward, and then finally love would answer to paradigmatic virtue. So on that model, you'd have 2 scales in parallel, the scale of inspiration and the scale of virtues, even though the scale of inspiration, so to speak, tops out higher than the scale of virtues. So you might not find that very persuasive, but it's there at T19. I'd love to talk about it if you have any evidence, pro or con, I could draw on for putting them together. So the last thing I wanted to say then is about how this version, this model of contemplation and action could help us with the practical life, leading a better life in practice. I have a few models here that are also in the handout, so I won't go through here, but we could come back to later. So we can see in Hermias, if we keep with the Phaedrus notes, an argument that the philosopher can act in practice in the world without leaving contemplation behind. Socrates is the exemplar here. He helps Phaedrus in discussion without abandoning the contemplative world. I think these passages are really interesting. I'm coming now to text 21 on the handout, where contemplation is the sort of primary activity of a person and a god. In text 21, the gods conduct their own secondary and tertiary activities while remaining in their primary activities and not departing from them. But if a person, while projecting a secondary or tertiary activity, abandons his primary activity, he errs. But for Socrates, the ascent to his own first principles or contemplation is easy and smooth. And that's because in the first place, he didn't abandon his primary activity when projecting the secondary one. That is, he didn't abandon contemplating when he was acting. This is a feat that the gods only can perform usually, but somehow Socrates does it too. And it seems like it's a different approach to the oblivious sage problem. He can simultaneously contemplate and act, which is very exciting. He wants to help Phaedrus in the context of this excerpt. So how does he manage it? He simply opens himself to inspiration in the right way, picking up the kinds of inspired virtue, the 4 I just talked about, and the peak in Damascius's letter. There's a long passage I won't read. It's text 23 on the handout, where we learn about how Socrates has opened himself to inspiration. And in this way, he's been able to perform this feat of not abandoning contemplative activity at the very same time as he acts in the sensible world. And here there's a different sort of philosophy of attention, a more Iamblichian one, I think, where it's not a spotlight-like focus on either sensibles or intelligibles, but just receptivity, like in the ladder of inspirations, like being a dancer, just being moved by the music. And incidentally, there's some interesting technical language in how Hermias characterizes it in passages like T23 and others we could talk about in the discussion. There's no sort of second order awareness or parakaleuthesis. We're not sort of tracking what we're doing. It's not like dancing and thinking, I'm dancing right now. We're just doing it. There's also no antilepsis and no fantasia, no representation to ourselves of what we're doing. It's just immediate. In a very artful excerpt from the Chaldean Oracles, text 24, maybe connecting with this or maybe not, there's the sense of a sort of empty mind receptive of the uniquely kind of hinatic intelligible. There's some nice verbs Hermias uses for this. Some of them seem to draw on Epicurean language, like epibole, haplai, epibolae. So a kind of non-representational and non-discursive awareness, something else that we could spend a long time talking about. But all of those passages put together help to explain how Socrates, in this sort of non-representative and immediate receptive attention, opens himself to the right kind of inspiration, and so in this sort of flow state acts at the same time as contemplating, not abandoning his primary activity. And I think that's a nice but different sort of solution to the oblivious sage puzzle. But the picture of the whole scale of virtues that we've talked about integrates both, maybe in parallel if you buy that idea, or at least one after the other, and perhaps in a way that's consistent across Olympiodorus, Damascius, Proclus, and Marinus, if you are at all persuaded by the way I attempted, however clumsily, to put them all together so that they could hold the sevenfold scale without any of them being seen as presenting a different stratification. So what really matters is the kind of receptivity of the performance of the action in that picture. So I'll close with a few implications. The later Neoplatonist philosopher follows two paths of moral progress. The one of single-pointed concentration on the forms. This is the more sort of philosophical Porphyrian model that alternates with action, what I called the painterly model in section 4, looking, as in Republic 6, between the original and the canvas of habits and the soul, back and forth with grace. And then secondly, this more Iamblichian, as I at least think, dancerly kind of model that we've met in Hermias and in some ways in Damascius, where in a way that's simultaneous, we're receptive to inspiration and so just act. Both of these involve not only a moral transformation, but also a perceptual transformation toward increasing attention to the forms or patterns in everything and sensitivity to the divine or inspiring in things. Very Platonic too, finding the beauty in symphonies and sunsets. The latter model is certainly prioritized, that is the model of inspiration, though I'm interested in exploring further this parallelism between them. And maybe there's one final implication to this, as Peter Brown argued, I think a long time ago in a classic article on the holy man in late antiquity, especially in Syria, the new Christian holy man couldn't be depersonalized in the way the old oracles were. He didn't lose his mind in the way that they did, not the same sort of ecstasis. And of course, this kind of mania of being possessed by what feels to be other is what our Neoplatonists in this talk at least defend. It's integral to the way that they unify contemplative absorption and action. It's because I'm feeling myself to be receptive to inspiration from another that I can contemplate and act at once in that second dancerly model that I presented. And not surprisingly, they also defended just the kinds of old oracular institutions that performed that kind of work. It was an attack on an institution like that, the Temple of Isis and its priestess, that elicited such a strong defense from the Neoplatonist professors in Alexandria and sparked the Paralyos riots with the Christian community. But I think Olympiodorus and his contemporaries show that this inspiration doesn't necessarily involve a loss of self in the way that some of those critics Brown alludes to implied. Certainly, as in text 25 on the handout, it looks like activity motivated by another, by the divine, is preferable to activity motivated by oneself. It benefits us to be led by a God rather than by ourselves. But as Plotinus already said in Ennead 6, 9, 10, which is the last text, 26 on the handout, the vision is hard to put into words of that receptive inspiration. For how could one announce that as another when they did not see there when they had the vision another at all, but one with himself in proseoton. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael, for this very clear and very rich talk.
Thank you for bearing with me for the whole thing.
Now it has been
very patient.
really inspirational. So we have plenty of time for discussion.
And if anybody needs the handout again, we can always, or all the text, I can post that again because I know.
Yes, I will send it again, but I can see that John Pinham or John has already raised his hand. So
hi, John.
Hello, I think I'm coming up there. It's good to see you.
Nice to see you.
Yes, thank you for the talk, which I enjoyed very much.
Thank you.
We've done a lot of stuff in parallel in what we're writing, so it's interesting to me.
I was just reading your article on exactly this. So that was one of the overviews that I found so helpful. Even yes,
Must be one of the
much
things
clearer.
you're happy this morning.
Yeah. Thank you.
I like what you're doing. I'm going to give you the problem I always have with this, and it comes from Iamblichus. Let me get a glass of water here. It comes from Iamblichus more than anybody else.
Always good to have something, some beverage for Iamblichus, I think.
Yeah,
yes.
absolutely. And it's the idea that when we do the hierarchy, the theurgy, they get up higher, our soul can do that for a while, but then instantly it's done and it has to return to its lower nature. It's part of the soul's process. It has this duality that's connected to it. It's its essence. So the way I read this is that, okay, I can go up to the intellect and intellectualize for a while, but I've got to stop and I've got to come back to my body. That means if this is going to work at all, that we have to be able to pick up something that can be retained in our soul. When we come down, we can go, I can't tell you exactly what the form of the good is anymore, but I have a really good notion of what it is now. It's staying with me like a harmony in music. And then I'm going to apply that in my life. With that work, with that second way that you were looking at as well.
That's really nice. Thank you. Well, I'm not sure. That really helped to clarify the issue for me. I think, so here, if I go back to some of those texts I was kind of ending with, I guess this is how I was thinking about it. What I gave is T21, the Hermias 77 to 78 excerpts, where it looks like we're referencing exactly that sort of problem, the kind of Nicomachean Ethics 10 problem already, that we're not gods because the gods can sort of just contemplate all the time, but we can't do that. We have to abandon our primary contemplative activity in order to come back down into the body. I got the sense from this second bit of the passage that I bolded that Socrates, unusually, if I'm not putting too much weight on this, didn't abandon the contemplative activity when he projected the secondary one. So this sort of, he doesn't do the forgetting part at all, which seems very unusual. And in fact, it's sort of a response to the assumption that we always must. So if that isn't too much weight to put on that, and it's right that somehow Socrates is giving us an example of not forgetting and kind of keeping the contemplation simultaneous with the action, then I guess my next move is to try to go to what I've given as T23, also Hermias 58 to 59, to explain how that works, that it is this sort of receptivity to the complete and divine illuminations that is non-representational, but still contemplative and allows action at the same time. So this is how Socrates is working this wonder, why he's sort of found a cheat code around the Nicomachean Ethics 10 problem, that he's receptive to inspiration in this way, but simultaneously acting without losing contemplation, specifically because he's not representationally perceiving anything. There's no fantasia, there's no antilepsis, that kind of terminology Porphyry picks up for the spotlight-like attention. That's not happening at all. He's just inspired into action, kind of like the dancer in the model that I was picking up. So in a way, I guess, coming to how I understood the question, at least, he's kind of forgotten all along, in the way that he's not representing, let's say, the form of the good to himself in any way. There's no fantasy and there's no antilepsis. He's just in touch with it and acting in that picture. So then psychologically, what does that picture look like for Hermias? It is the inspiration of the one of the soul cascading through the whole person right to the body. That includes Nous and dianoia and thumos and epithumia and soma, and the whole kind of personhood is inspired. And that therefore is a very different sort of picture of agency and perception and mentation than the other parallel scale, where exactly what you were describing is pretty typical, because it's going back and forth. Let's say the inspiration is just of Nous, not the one of the soul, and that is contemplative goodness, let's say, but then we have the quick spotlight alternation and the possibility of forgetting what we were picturing to ourselves, and we have to go back and forth to kind of renew or charge all the time. So sort of long-winded answer, I guess I would say yes. I think that you could sort of solve that puzzle in both scales, but in the one of them, you do have the kind of forgetting and renewal, the alternation model, the painterly model, and in the other, it's just kind of all at once because of that unique picture of non-representational inspiration that is compatible with action at the same time. But I feel like I'm putting a lot of weight on a few phrases, and I don't know if it works.
What you're doing, I think, is really important, is bringing that Phaedrus commentary into the mix. Because that really, I think this helps. But it does mean that the taking the one of the soul then is that it's involved in the theurgical, right? It gets you where you have to go. Then you have to let go of it, but there's still something like magical about it. It keeps pulsating within us. Yeah, this is very good. Keep it up.
Oh, thank you.
Good for me.
Thank you.
Professor Shepard.
Hi. Speaking of the Hermias commentary, where I got thank
right.
you.
Yes.
Good to
Well,
see
thank you. Thank you, and thank you. No, that was really, really interesting. Lots to think about, because I've also been thinking about the scale of virtues recently. I was wondering whether some of the difference between what you very interestingly call the painterly and the dancerly model, and indeed between some of the Plotinus passages and the rest, isn't some of that to do with Plotinus, the difference between Plotinus' view of the soul and the later view, notoriously Plotinus thinking that part of our soul doesn't fall. So if part of our soul doesn't fall, it can be contemplating, and I mean that's one possible interpretation of what's going on in T9, I guess, isn't it? That it's the undescended bit of his soul that's contemplating all the time. Whereas if, like Iamblichus and its successors, you think that that's just not what happens, that things are kind of going up and down all the time, to put it rather crudely, then you get a different sort of picture, and you get the sort of picture that you and John Finnemore have just been talking about. So, I mean, that's
yes.
part of what's going on.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Yes, I totally agree. And I remember another dimension of the distinction with Plotinus, where not only is there the challenge of the undescended soul and the attention that results, but I think also Proclus at one point criticizes Plotinus, and I think it's Theodore, for making everything inside me, inside myself. I think in the Timaeus commentary that our psyche contains everything, even the one of the soul, but in a sort of haplos way, it's just all inside of me. And yeah, that sort of, I guess also could play a part in this, even though it seems to me like Proclus at least agrees that that's true in an attenuated way. It's sort of all inside me relationally, but just not in a complete and simple way. So I guess if it is all in me, it's easier to imagine this kind of graceful alternation. But yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thank you. I like the Plotinian picture. Always makes me feel optimistic too. That there's something undescended somewhere in me, I hope. So yes, I'd like to work more on that. Thanks, Anne.
Thank you. If there is no question for the moment, I could perhaps step in with a couple of questions.
Please.
Okay, thank you. So the first one is probably similar to Anne's question. So were you saying, Anne, that T9 could be read in parallel with T21 in a way?
Yes, that was part of it, and that they would both be reading both of them in terms of well, yes, that's right, I was. So T21 is the Hermias, isn't it? Yes, and maybe for Hermias, Socrates is somebody rather special, who doesn't just, whose soul doesn't just, whose self doesn't just change, to put it in Carlos Steele's terms. But that wouldn't be the case for all of us, and then we wouldn't all be able to be like Socrates. So maybe it's not that optimistic.
Yes. That's true. That's what I'm wondering about. Well, yes, sorry, back Irene. Yes.
No. My intention was to launch discussion. So my idea was that the way Hermias describes Porphyry, Socrates, reminds me of the way Porphyry describes Plotinus. In a sense, T9 could be read as saying that Plotinus did not abandon his primary activity, because if you look at the Greek, on the one hand you have the ania, the anoia, so the anoumenos. On the other hand, you have the allegomenos, and it is a kind of logos that comes as a secondary activity of the ania. So in a sense, what happens in T9 is that Plotinus does not abandon his primary activity, whether you talk about the undescended soul or not. So that was one thing I thought, and it was quite close to your question.
To what Anne was saying, good point.
Yes. So shall I go on, or would you like to say a few things on that?
I could say very quickly, thank you both. I understand better, and that does seem really helpful. And I guess a couple of comments. One is that I thought that Socrates is clearly a very special person, but still presented as a model that we can follow. And I got that out of texts like T23 and generally how Hermias talks about the one of the soul and inspiration. So I thought in my T23, which is around Hermias 58 to 59, it seems like there's an explanation of how Socrates is able to do this, that he has an excellence in making himself receptive to these inspirations and illuminations. But I don't think the way that it's characterized in T23 at least suggests that it isn't something we could all do if we open ourselves to inspiration in the same way. It's just a different kind of skill than the virtue of attention that we talked about separately. And I guess you could read T22, which I didn't go over, but that's around Hermias 93, this kind of lovely account of the descent of the soul and its return, to suggest that everybody's really in the same situation. Like the kind of psychology and stratification metaphysically of every person has all these levels of the soul, and we've kind of fallen in the same way, and we can return in the same way. So anyway, that's just a kind of riff on the thought that Socrates is certainly exceptional, but not inimitable, if that's right. And then on T9, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I thought there's kind of a helpful hinge in one of the other wiggly puzzles that I didn't really talk about, which is why Olympiodorus in his Phaedo commentary, my T13, credits Plotinus with paradigmatic virtue, where Damascius credits Iamblichus with paradigmatic virtue. And Olympiodorus, that could be like a glitch or sort of like explicable in some other source critical way, but I think maybe it helps with what you're talking about, and I think both could be true. So he explains that Plotinus is supposed to have given us an understanding of paradigmatic virtue just as Porphyry schematizes it, because when we contemplate the forms, we eventually simply become them. And it's true that Iamblichus might put this in theurgic terms and Plotinus might put it in different terms, but it sort of can be seen as the same level, where we're becoming the object that we were contemplating, and the subject and the object are somehow unified. And yeah, I think that you could say that the same thing is, so to put this differently, I think what Olympiodorus means is that the same thing is going on in Plotinus's ability to do this in T9, and in the receptive, inspired psychology of Socrates in Hermias, that in fact, it's the same psychological kind of receptivity and process, but it's just the kind of schema that explains it is different. In the one, it's about inspiration from something else. And in the other, for Plotinus, it's about simply what I really am. But they're just different ways of describing the same underlying process. So if that's true, and if that's an explanation at all, then I think I would be on the same page that that's kind of what's going on in T9, but they're positioning it differently. For the post-Iamblichian Platonists, it's something other. And for Plotinus, it's still me. Sorry, yes, that was a riff on that before you go on. I know there's more.
No, it is really persuasive. I have a second question, but as it is on a different topic, perhaps Professor Dillon could step in and then we get back to my question if there is time.
Hello, John.
Muted, or am I okay?
I can hear you perfectly. Oh, you might be muted again now, though. Sorry.
Now,
Perfect.
I wanted just to apologize for being late and missing what was obviously an excellent talk, and to congratulate you on it and greet you. But one thought has always sort of intrigued me, and I don't know if you addressed that at the beginning, that this scale of virtues has always seemed to me to be a series of, well, an initial misunderstanding by Porphyry of Plotinus was intending to say in 1-2, because now Porphyry may not have been a matter of misunderstanding the great man, but just tidying him up. But what Ploty says is that there are these two levels of virtue, which is the main point, that the purificatory virtues are the more perfect virtues, and then in Nous, there are paradigms of virtues which are prior to virtue, as in chapter 7, he starts with this. So the paradigms are not virtues, they're paradigms of virtue. And they weren't intended to be a kind of scale or whatever. But once Porphyry presents them as paradigms, then my favorite guy takes the ball and runs with it. And then you've got more virtues at the bottom and virtues at the top, and you've got a scale. So it seems that the whole thing got a bit out of hand, frankly. But that's my only thought on that question. But it all makes a great story.
Yes, for what it's worth, I think I'm completely persuaded by you and things you've written about that, and by Dominic too. Omara, I think, has argued along a somewhat similar line that that yes, the schematization in Porphyry sentences is either misunderstanding or overly schematizing Plotinus in just that way, which of course we all love to some degree, maybe, or we wouldn't be here. But yes, that talking about the paradigmata is not really to talk about paradigmaticae arete in the way that Porphyry wants it to be, and maybe it is more than a terminological difference. So yes, I think I would agree with that too. And I was going to say, by the way, John, I don't know if you were here for this part, but I started out with this puzzle of the oblivious sage, so-called, and I think I remembered that the example I had of the contemplative who is so absorbed that they aren't in a position to help somebody across the road comes from you. And I wondered if you still think of it, how you would solve that puzzle yourself. Not to put you on the spot, but I wondered if over the years since you wrote about it, you've thought about it differently.
I've been teased about that quite a lot, but no, I think that part of his view of well, I suppose strongly stoicized virtue, that the spudaios, or the wise man, is not affected by external disasters such as losing his family or his fatherland or that sort of thing. But I mean, my position with him was that if he did see an old lady crossing the road, wanting to cross the road, he would certainly have helped her across. But if she wandered out by herself and was hit by a passing dray, he would have remained unmoved. But that is as a spudaios.
Yes, I see.
That's the only difference. But he would want to help. But no, at the higher level, you are not to be you are not to be affected by these external things. Although you can have a benign view of trying to help. Yeah, but that was that's what I meant.
Yes, I see. No, thank you. That makes sense. I understand. And yes, then we would hope that the inspired Socrates I was talking about in Hermias has inspiration that allows him to notice people crossing the road.
Yes, you've noticed.
Yes. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Jonathan Nilsson.
Hi, Jonathan.
Yes, thank you. Hello, Michael. I'm Jonathan Nelson from University of Providence in Montana.
Nice
Thank
to
you
meet
very
you.
much. Nice to meet you. Thank you very much for the very interesting talk. And I don't have much of a question, but just a suggestion. And so, I've been thinking a lot about the first Alcibiades, because I always teach this in my introduction to philosophy course, and I use Olympiodorus and Damascius and Proclus's commentaries quite a bit. So I was just revisiting at the end of the semester. And so when you started talking at the end of the presentation about receptivity and the dancerly model, it made me immediately think of Olympiodorus's commentary on the Alcibiades, the lecture 5, when he talks, he talks specifically about the Coryphaios, right? Which seems to be this reference to the Theaetetus digression, which I think is a very like this worldly picture of a philosopher, really. But in lecture 5, as you know, right, there's all this talk about receptivity and about how the divine lover is always present and ready to like share goodness, thinking that at some point the pupil will become able to be receptive. But I think you could profitably use this to show, well, look, Socrates is both receptive, right? And he's waiting for the moment when Alcibiades will be. And as soon as Alcibiades is receptive, then Socrates is able to do his divine work of fulfillment, right? The divine always acts for fulfillment. And so if one of these virtues is becoming like God, well, how is it that the gods actually act in Plato and the Platonist tradition? It's always on behalf of an other, right? Because they, as being in the best position already, they can't act on their own behalf, right? And so the love that Socrates has for Alcibiades and this wanting to even unite him, right? Because unity is one of the most important aspects of the gods, and so Socrates even stands in the middle between, because the gap between Alcibiades and the gods is large, right? So a lot of the themes I think that you talk about are there in that lecture 5, and you have many strong passages already in your favor. But this could be a profitable place to bring some of these together. At least it's been helpful to me. So thank you.
Thank you. Oh, thank you, Jonathan. I'm so excited to hear that you're using the Alcibiades one in Intro to Philosophy and Olympiodorus and Damascius. I'm so happy about that. And yes, I agree. Thank you for the references. I really appreciate that. And of course, those lectures are dear to my heart. So I'm looking forward to drawing on lecture 5 more. And I know one of the passages I had in mind that I didn't get to is from, I think it's lecture 4, where around page 20 to 21, Olympiodorus is talking about how living in receptivity to the divine or to the allotted daimon is sort of living according to your essence or ousia. And for example, living the life of words and ideas if you're flowing from the chain of Hermes and so on. And that there's a kind of authenticity to living like that, to living in a walk of life that reflects your divine inspiration receptively. So I feel like there's a lot more to draw on there that brings this sort of picture of the receptive life out. So thank you.
Indeed.
Thank you. So perhaps waiting for another question, I could ask my second one, if you agree, Michael.
Please.
Okay, so it is about T11. And I was wondering whether you could say a little bit more on this distinction between virtues that are, because the participle is uses, substantial, usiodis, and on the other hand, virtues that exist in a unitary way. So could you say a little bit more on what this means, and would there be a connection with a correspondence between ethics and metaphysics here, in the sense that enye reminds me of the enads, iparchuse, iparxis. So is there something like this here, or am I completely?
No, I love that. Thank you. And I'm looking at it now in a beautiful Prometheus Trust-bound version of Damascius. I think how I had read it, rightly or wrongly, I don't know, that in T11 that kind of, they correspond to all of those we just mentioned, with the difference that, well, the others are usiodethin, in the dative, these are heniai. I was reading that in light of, I think, Damascius's, and also more explicitly from the text I cited, Hermias's picture of the psychology or the kind of stratigraphy of the psyche. So the all the virtues of the one of the soul are those that are heniai here, and the virtues that belong to Nous are usiodes here. In keeping with the idea of this, as you said, the sort of metaphysical henats and the level of being that is also the intelligibles and intelligence. And then if you took it that way, and in my picture, they're maybe in parallel with one kind of going a bit higher than the other, but if you took it that way, then all the inspirations that Hermias talks about and Damascius is reflecting on here belong to the one of the soul in their truest sense, as Hermias says. And those could be the four in the Phaedrus, or as Hermias says, there's lots of other kinds of inspiration too. Those four are just jointly sufficient. That would be the those that are inspirations of the one of the soul. And then the ones that are Nous, the usiodes ones, how would that capture the whole rest of the scale? Well, I think in this way, that as Damascius says, you get some of the virtues by the mind looking up, some of them by it looking into itself, and some by it looking down. But it's all really usiodes, that is, it is all of the being or the nous of the person. So you get the, starting from the bottom, you get the civic virtues from the nous looking down. You get the cathartic virtues from the nous sort of working with itself in the sense of the nous of the soul here, purifying itself in order to get to looking up to the contemplative virtues and eventually becoming one with what it's contemplating in the paradigmatic virtues. So all of those can be seen in some way in this later stratigraphy as usiodes, as having to do with nous and its direction of attention. Whereas this sort of stack of inspired practices or inspirations all have to do with the one of the soul. And that's how you would understand, in my picture at least, the heniaios and usiodes distinction in Damascius 144. I don't know how well that works, but I do like it when they all tidally match up. And I remember Harold Tarrant was warning me the last time I talked about this, that it rarely actually all lines up the way you want it to, but that would be how I try to make it line up.
No, but I think it is the same. I mean, it is persuasive, and this is the way I tend to understand it as well. So all the virtues are usiodes, and then the hieratic virtues are unitary. But
yes,
but, I would say that the unitary ones are like a model.
Yes.
Yes.
A model, yes, I think so too. I guess I'm again maybe putting too much weight on it, but that idea that there's a kind of correspondence between them in the plural works for me with the idea that, for example, the inspiration by the muses that harmonizes the soul could be seen as a model and inspiration of the civic virtues, or and so on for all of them, that you can see the inspiration comes first, but underlies our capacity to engage in the more sort of the ordinary, or the kind of nous directing kind of virtue. So yeah, I agree. I think there's a causality that flows from inspiration to virtue, no matter which ladder you're climbing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions or remarks or comments?
Thank you for the very helpful pointers so far.
Thank you for enlightening us with all this
Oh, thank you.
clear.
It's always a treat to get to talk about this, even though thank you again for bearing with me going through so long.
So if there are no other questions, perhaps we should thank Michael once again for this very clear and inspirational talk. And renew our appointment for October and Professor George Karamanoli's talk on Porphyrian soul.
Wonderful.
Thank you all for being here for the discussion. Thank you, Michael, and looking forward to seeing you in Crete as well in autumn.
Me too. On to Athens and Alexandria. We could talk more about the underlat when we get there.
That's for sure. So thank you very much. And thank you all. See you soon.
Thank you so much for coming. See you soon.
Thank you.
Bye, Irene. See you soon.